All right, this is it. This is the final stretch. The last set of lectures that we're going to do for Bio 102. Today we're covering global ecology and conservation. The goal is to identify 3 kinds of biodiversity and the major threats to them. There are more than 1.8 million named species, and that seems like a lot. Most of those species, as you can see, are invertebrates. The vertebrates are actually a very, very, very tiny little wedge right over there. Um, it's the invertebrates that make up a lot of our named species. But 1.8 million is a lot less than the between 5 and 100 million species that we estimate are on Earth right now. We've described a very small portion of the overall biodiversity on the Earth. Most of the species diversity that we know of exists in the tropics, which is why they are typically considered a critical region of the planet. We have the widest variety of species there, maybe not the most numbers of organisms, but the most varied organisms. Due to disturbances, these tropics are being rapidly deforested. It's leading to the loss of a lot of unique species. Their habitats being entirely replaced by arid and farmable land. We're removing the tropical rainforest and converting it into large grassy plains. To discuss this, we need to understand conservation biology. Conservation biology is an intersection point of a lot of different sciences, from mathematics to statistics, biogeography and geology, botany, epidemiology, chemistry, zoology, evolution, genetics, and ecology. Quite literally everything we've talked about for the last year comes together in conservation biology. So when we talk about conservation biology, we talk a lot about biodiversity. Biodiversity has 3 distinct levels: ecosystem diversity, genetic diversity, and species diversity. Genetic diversity is the genetic variation within a population and between populations. Here we can see the kiwi fruit. Now you probably look at a kiwi, you see it in a store, and you think, that's a kiwi fruit. I know it, because it looks like a kiwi fruit, and it probably tastes like a kiwi fruit. It's got a delicious green center and a fuzzy outside that you really shouldn't eat. But if you look at the diversity among the kiwis and even the kiwi berries, you'll see that they're similar, but they have a lot of differences, from a much deeper, darker green on the inside to bright red insides. Ecosystem diversity is the diversity found between ecosystems that species depend on for survival. What you see in this graph is precipitation versus annual average temperatures. And you'll notice there's these distinct ecosystems ranked here: the tundra, the boreal forest, the temperate forest, the tropical rainforest. What separates these is temperature and precipitation. Quite simply put, when an environment is altered, organisms die. And that's really the theme we're looking at here. Change something and everything dies if they can't adapt. Let's look at the coral reefs down near Australia. Right now, they're being bleached. The temperature levels are too high. There's lack of oxygen in the water, and the corals are dying off, going from bright, vivid colors to pure white because they are dead. And when they're dead, the organisms that depend on them for survival die. We cannot continue to alter the environment without leading to rapid die-offs of the organisms that depend on that environment. So ultimately, with biodiversity, who cares? You hear this a lot. Why should I care that there's lots of different organisms out there? I have cows, I eat cows, all I need are cows. But biodiversity affects you personally in many different ways. First off, we can exploit biodiversity. The best solution, or the best answer to this, is the selfish solution. Threatened species that are on the verge of extinction may be exploited for medicine or for unique gene understandings that could help humanity. We've discovered many of our different medications from organisms in these areas that are rapidly being deforested and that are rapidly being destroyed. We found drugs that are 1,000 times more powerful than morphine in the secretions of frogs in the Amazon that only live in a 1 square kilometer region. If we can exploit these organisms, we can improve ourselves. So it behooves us to protect those areas in which we might find them. Again, we're going to stick with the idea that we are selfish beings. It's really expensive to purify systems. Ecosystems purify air and water. They detoxify and decompose waste. They pollinate our crops. They preserve soil. Ecosystems do a lot of the work that we would typically need to do mechanically if we did not have a diverse biosystem. In the end, replacing current biodiversity and current ecosystems with mechanical means of replacing them. So removing an ecosystem, putting in farmable land, putting in something, a city, we would have to then invest approximately $33 trillion a year to do those same services that an ecosystem would normally do mechanically. If we run out of bees, for instance, because we wiped them out using insecticides as we're clearing out land, in order to work on in order to make pollination happen, we would have to do that either by hand or through mechanical means, and that costs money. And we just don't have that kind of money on the planet. There are a lot of threats to biodiversity right now. Habitat loss, introduced species, overharvesting, and global climate change. So we're going to focus specifically on population size, genetic diversity, and maintaining a critical habitat. First off, let's look at populations. Small populations are more vulnerable to habitat loss than larger populations. If you have a small population, let's say the great white shark, it's a relatively small population of organisms. By removing just a few of those, you've had a serious impact on the genetic diversity of the entire group. These small populations tend to be a lot more adapted to a specific niche. So by losing that niche, they die off at a much higher rate than other organisms. As population size decreases, they start losing that genetic diversity, and that makes them more vulnerable to selective pressure. If you start off with a high population size, a lot of genetic variation, you can suddenly lose that population. It goes down in value. As that population goes down, the allelic frequencies shift, and you end up losing unique alleles that may have given certain organisms within that population an adaptive advantage. When the population numbers begin to rise, the genetic diversity doesn't rise at the same rate. It will take millions of years to recover the genetic diversity lost from one near extinction event. A good example of this is the walrus. Walruses were hunted for their tusks because, ivory. When the walrus population got down to about 200 in the entire world, you've lost genetic diversity. You're down to a small inbreeding population. Over time, regulation was put in place to protect the walruses, and now we're up near 200,000 walruses in the world. We have thousands and thousands of walruses, but they're all genetically related to each other. They all have the same basic genes, which means that if there's another event that happens, some disease goes through the population, they're all going to be susceptible to the same thing. Now, please bear in mind, there is a big difference between an endangered species and a rare species. Just because an organism is rare, just because it's not seen often, does not mean that it is endangered. Oftentimes, when you think of a rare species, a Greenland shark, for instance. You don't see it often, but what ends up happening is that organism is in no danger of being Greenland shark's a bad example. It is endangered as well. But there are other, or now that I think about it, a lot of species are really endangered now because of the modern changes to the environment. But a rare species is one that you will not see often, but it is not actively in danger of disappearing off the planet. That's compared to an endangered species that is very close, is on the precipice of disappearing forever. All populations have what's called a viable population size, a minimum size necessary to survive and maintain genetic diversity. This is called the MVP, the minimum viable population. Once you get below the minimum viable population, the odds of an unstable extinction event become much higher. Now, if you think about rare species versus endangered species, top-tier predators are often going to be rare species, not necessarily endangered species. And that's because you need so much fewer top-tier predators than you would the organisms they prey upon. So here we have these issues of biodiversity. We have habitat loss, we have exploitation, we have all of these problems with maintaining our current levels of biodiversity and conservation. And the reason for that is because of conflicting demands. Then nobody's arguing that humans don't need resources. We absolutely do. The issue becomes, how do we balance? How do we decide when we protect species or when we engage for our own benefit? At what point does protecting a species benefit us more than harming that species? So we have these conflicting demands we need to balance. We need to balance this biodiversity. And we're always creating new what are called boundaries. Physical features of a landscape influence that biodiversity. Physical features create boundaries. Here you can see the edge of a field leading right up to a forest. That's a boundary. A mountain range is a boundary. An ocean is a boundary. And as humans, we keep changing the boundaries. Boundaries define landscapes, and boundaries are where you're going to have a lot of diversity. That's because most organisms are going to live on the edge. They thrive on the edge because they can get resources from both regions. When we change a boundary, we're changing the edge. We reduce biodiversity because creating a new edge pushes back a range of a group of organisms. This is why you're going to see bears walking around in downtown, or deer randomly popping up in people's yards. This used to be their range, and we have changed it. When we create more boundaries, when we create boundaries that are around natural landscapes, they lead to what's called fragmentation. This isolates populations, causing them to interbreed or inbreed, leading to decreased genetic diversity.